In this lesson, we're going to talk about temperature, fuel, and color. And to do that, we're going to have to jump around in the attribute editor a little bit and use some of the different areas that we haven't touched as well as some of the areas that we have. So let's get started. All right, I went ahead and made a file called lesson 10. You can actually load this file or you can continue right where we left off in the previous lesson. So here we go. And that's essentially what we had. So I'm going to go ahead and close up velocity and turbulence. Actually, I may turn down turbulence just a bit. Let's go ahead and type this in, 0.05. We just want just a little bit of noise. There we go. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and talk about temperature, fuel, and color. However, if we open up temperature, you'll notice that everything is grayed out. Well, the reason it's grayed out is because remember at the very top under the content methods, temperature is turned off. So let's go ahead and turn this on to dynamic grid. And now when I come down, you'll notice that I can have access to the controls here in my temperature settings. Here's the problem. If I play this back and I move the slider, you notice it has no effect on my simulation. Well, the reason it has no effect is I'm not really looking at my temperature. I'm looking at density. So what I need to do is come up to display right here and choose this shaded display instead of as render to temperature. And now you can see that is completely different than what I was looking at before. And if I play this back, I can actually have a huge impact on what's happening. So this is how, if you have an emitter, your ability to create a multiplier or a scalar to allow this emitter to also emit temperature, but have it at a different rate. Now, this temperature can also have its own buoyancy level. So if I reduce this down, you'll notice that my temperature just kind of hangs low. Like that. So I'll just leave it up like that. I can also dissipate this accordingly. So if I increase the dissipation all the way, you notice it blurs out. I can also do the diffusion and let it spread. Okay, or keep it very focused. And then it can have its own turbulence. So I'll just leave some of that going. Now, that's temperature. That's not what we're going to actually preview. What we're going to view is as rendered, and you can see how that all comes together. Now, you can see the density and temperature. Okay, and you'll see that as a gradient, so it'll show you where the hot areas are and where the cool areas are, as in lots of data and not much data. Okay, and this is compounded together. And so let's now take a look at fuel. Now I have nothing for fuel because it's not turned on. So again, go back up to our contents method, choose fuel, change it to dynamic grid. Now when I hit rewind and play, I'll actually see a little bit of fuel. Now the problem with fuel is it is emitted and then it's done. So let's crank this scale up a little bit. There we go. And our reaction speed, lower that so it's a little bit slower to react. Now ignition temperature, let's talk about these for just a second. These guys are paired up. So ignition temperature and max temperature are working in cahoots together. So the ignition temperature is pretty much saying, don't ignite until you reach this temperature. Okay? And then once you've reached this temperature, ignite, essentially use up all the fuel that's available, and keep going until you reach this max temperature. And anything after max temperature, quickly burn off the fuel. Okay? This is going to tell us how much heat gets released, because we may want to shade the heat differently, as well as how much light is released. Now, if I crank this light released up, what it's going to do is take whatever this light color is and multiply that with, if I open up shading and go down to incandescence, it's going to add this as a multiplier here. So right now our incandescence is showing temperature, and that is going to be a modifier, this light released, of that temperature. So let's go ahead and rewind and play this. All right, very cool. So this is showing our fuel, and before I get into color, let's actually preview this. So again, we can preview this two different ways. One, if we're going to use the shading color, then we need to set our shaded display to as render. And then we need to pick some other color than white. I recommend just choosing black, hit accept, and what that will now do is essentially multiply this by 0 and then let the incandescence come through. So whatever is incandescence here, so for example, if I have, let's say, blue and yellow, that's what's going to show up. Okay, so maybe I have this set to white. Okay, that's how that's set up. So let's preview this. Let me just reset this back to my red and yellow. Okay, so you notice we start off, and then we have a reaction that takes place. Now, if we go up and return back to our temperature, let me just roll this down, and fuel, we can now start to tweak these settings. So for example, if I increase the temperature to go higher, you notice now the heat is towards the top here, and I can reduce my fuel, the amount of fuel that I'm introducing into the system. Okay, and I'll decrease the reaction speed. And let's increase the temperature. So it'll now build up a little bit longer before it actually ignites. And I'm going to reduce my heat released. So I'm not releasing a lot of heat, all right? And remember, the temperature is what we're looking at here, the temperature of this system. So even though I have a reaction taking place, I'm not releasing a lot of heat. Okay, so if I release very little heat, you'll see my reaction is completely different than if I release a lot of heat. So, like I said, it's a lot of fun. You can really have a neat time playing with this. Notice, though, in fuel, you don't have a dissipation or diffusion attribute. Those don't exist within the fuel because the fuel is really a source. If we're going to be adding gasoline to this or butane or whatever our fuel source is, we're not going to dissipate that out. We're just going to do that with the temperature. All right, so what if we wanted to actually let the system control this? Well, let me just close all this up here. If I go to color, you'll notice that they are grayed out. Again, the pattern is if they're grayed out, come back up to the top, and where it says color method, let's change that from use shading color, which is using that setup, to dynamic grid. Now when I choose dynamic grid, all these colors are mixing. Well, we got, again, a totally different look, right? And you have to determine what's important. But we have a couple of really cool setups here. One is the dissipation. So if I increase this color dissipation, okay, let me just increase that and play this back. You'll notice that as this gets higher, my color is actually blending together exactly where my particles are. I also have the ability to diffuse that color. Okay, so let's render this and show you a before and after. So let me just store this. This is a before, and I'll set these to 0. Play that back a few frames, and then re-render. So before and after, okay? And what we're essentially changing is the amount of color that the system will dissipate within that actual simulation, and then how much of that color we're going to diffuse and blur out. So again, we get a nice, smoother effect by just adding a little bit of these settings.